At the end of the 18th century, an unknown artist painted this view of Maryland plantation Perry Hall, located about 20 miles north of Baltimore. As a fairly common pictorial type at the time, this image offered an early American landowner named Harry Dorsey Gough an opportunity to showcase his taste, his wealth, and his power through an idyllic depiction of his property. The painting, which is now on display in the Blackwell Parlor at Winterthur Museum, was probably designed to hang over a central fireplace like this one, serving as a conspicuous reminder at the time of the picture's creation to visitors and to the family itself of the Gough's elevated social position. To contemporary eyes, however, the most striking feature of the image is the unusual presence of a Black girl at the center of the painting. Though historical interpretations of Perry Hall focused on it as a memorial to the Goughs and as an emblem of elite power and status, a present-day understanding of our country's racial history, coupled with the relative rarity of an 18th century object that comments directly on an enslaved person's experience, demands a reassessment of the painting that explicitly addresses this girl's presence. The Gough family has been written about extensively, remembered in particular as early adopters of Methodism. Their relations, the Carrolls, some of whom also appear in the painting alongside Harry Dorsey Gough and his wife, have a house museum of their own in the form of Mount Clare in Baltimore. Today, I would like to focus our attention on other questions about this painting and to ask what work can be done to investigate the experience of this girl. Who might she have been, and how might we describe her lived experience? Before looking at the Perry Hall picture from this perspective, I want to begin with a brief overview of Black representation in the 18th century colonies and the young republic, to provide some background on how such images typically function and how they've been interpreted by art historians and historians. Although Black representation was rare in the 18th century, early American portraits did occasionally include Black figures. Examples were usually composed according to an earlier trope associated with the Anglo-European aristocracy, where the dark skin of an often young Black figure was intended to set off the complexion of the central white sitter, while the pose and the fawning gaze of the Black figure emphasizes the power of the subject of the portrait. This power dynamic could be asserted even when the white sitter was a child, as in this picture by Hesselius, or it could function similarly in a construction where the central sitter is an adult. Images like this on the left clearly look back to the earlier pictorial tradition represented at right. The image at left was painted by the Connecticut-born portraitist Ralph Earl after he received training in London, where he could certainly have been exposed to the traditional tropes like the one we see represented in the portrait on the right by the influential portraitist Anthony van Dyck, who was the leading court painter in England in the 17th century. Earl clearly borrows here from Anglo-European traditions with his composition, employing the Black boy to signal the status of the unknown white sitter. A problem with the standard line of interpretation of portraits like these is that it looks at the Black figure only from the perspective of what he does for the white sitter. While this is important to consider in order to understand the picture's original intention, I think the approach can also be reductive if further questions are not asked, including the basic questions that we routinely ask of the central sitter. Who was this person? It's often assumed that because of their pictorial status as props, these Black figures are not portraits. But could this Black boy have been a real person? What were or what could have been some of the facts of his life or of the life of someone in similar circumstances? Just to share with you an example of a contemporary artist who is asking these questions visually through his own artistic practice. Here's a really interesting work by Titus Gaffar, which is a response to the Earl, recentering our attention through the perforations in the canvas and through the highly particularized portrait of a Black boy whom the artist based on his neighbor and whom he gives a name in the title, Javon and the Unknown Gentleman. 18th century works that go beyond the traditional painted portrait format can serve as a further prompt for questions about the possible historical reality of 18th century Black subjects. An original compositional approach is found here in this 18th century allegorical needlework picture created by Prudence Punderson of Connecticut. And we can read this image from right to left with 3 stages of life as the first stage of birth, represented by the cradle, the central stage of adulthood, and finally the stage of death, represented by the coffin with the initials PP for Prudence Punderson. Scholarship holds this to be a self-portrait of Punderson in the center, and it's therefore reasonable to suggest that the Black woman at right could also represent a living individual, perhaps the enslaved woman who's known to have lived in the Punderson household. So what we have here is likely not just an imaginary Black figure dreamed up to convey status, but a woman whom Punderson could have known. The historian Laurel Thatcher Ulrich has uncovered a possible identification for this figure. A Punderson family will makes provision for the financial support of a Black woman named Jenny. Later records tell us more of this woman's story and enrich our understanding of this picture beyond its traditional interpretation as a document of the colonial domestic interior or as a document of white women's history. Jenny, who's also sometimes referred to as Jane in the documentary record, we know married twice, and unusually at the end of her life, she left her own will, a remarkable act in the face of the many legal and cultural forces that sought to deprive her of her individual agency as a Black woman living in the late 18th and early 19th century. Knowing these details of Jane or Jenny Punderson's life significantly changes our experience of this picture. With this in mind, I want to turn our attention back to the Perry Hall painting and how we might reframe our understanding of this work to speak about Black history and possibly about the particular history of the featured Black girl, going beyond the message of elite status that the painting was originally created to celebrate. I'll begin with a review of the historiography of the Perry Hall painting and its place within the context of other similar estate paintings from this time period. Passed down through several generations of the original owner's descendants, the Perry Hall painting's history as an heirloom affirmed its original purpose as a representation of power. Possibly originally intended to hang in Perry Hall itself, the painting later became the property of Gough's daughter and her family, taking a place on the walls of Mount Clare. Continued ownership of the grand estate view served to carry on the family's association with wealth. Simultaneously, it facilitated the enactment of new ideas during the later 19th and early 20th centuries about the possession of early American objects as markers of superior lineage. Purchased by Henry Francis DuPont in 1939, the painting's placement at Winterthur would emphasize its decorative value. Records relating to DuPont's display of the piece center on questions of aesthetics. The collector seems to have been chiefly concerned about which room the painting would best fit in and best conform to physically. Ultimately, DuPont chose the Blackwell parlor, and with his choice, he obscured some of the painting's peripheral outbuildings in order to fit it into the space over the mantle. Here's a historical image of the painting, which shows at far right, you can see there's a bit more description of the landscape and of some buildings there. With this decision, DuPont clearly favored general visual impact over historically important details of the painting. Specifically, he covered up representations of an agricultural complex, which may well have included residences that relate directly to the history of slavery at the plantation. Although now removed from its original context, like most estate paintings, Perry Hall would also continue to function in a museum space during the 20th century as a totem of elite ancestry, providing an opportunity to memorialize its original owners by reference to their splendid historic estate. The work's assigned title, Perry Hall, Home of Harry Dorsey Gough, underlines those aspects of the painting that had historically been considered most salient. Perry Hall was the named, i.e. important residence of an important man associated with two important families, both the Dorseys and the Goughs. The assertion of this title assumed an understanding of the significance of names such as this on the part of the viewer. So really creating a barrier for anyone who might be unaware of these names. Recording the landscape in this way, the painting's title sustained the painting's primary meaning as a visual document of the power and continued preeminence of one of Maryland's founding families. In keeping with this interpretation, early mid-20th century research on the Perry Hall painting related principally to efforts at naming and identification. The painting inspired lengthy debate about attribution, as evidenced in letters between Henry Francis DuPont, the dealer Joe Kindig, and the scholar J. Hall Pleasance, in which the correspondence weighed various factors for and against such artists as Francis Guy and Charles Willson Peale. Both attributions have since been rejected, and the author of the picture remains unknown. Considering stylistic factors alongside the Gough genealogy, previous catalog entries and notes also suggest identifications for each of the white figures in the painting, likely to include Harry Dorsey Gough on horseback at left, his son James McCubbin Carroll, who's facing away from the picture, looking back towards Harry Dorsey Gough, Gough's wife, Prudence Gough, who appears in the purplish dress, his daughter, Sophia Gough Carroll in white, and his grandsons, James and Harry. Even the horse has tentatively been identified based on Gough's history of breeding activities. Scholars believe that he was called Narragansett. Notably, however, the Black girl at the center of the painting has long gone unnamed. This was perhaps because researchers assumed it was impossible to name her, that like so much early African-American history, no records existed to identify her, which is always a real possibility when researching Black subjects. And another likely reason is that this girl appears by nature of the painting's composition to be a supporting figure rather than a main character in the narrative. In this sense, the interpretation of the painting continues the legacy of marginalization in the painter's original composition. The focus on naming those considered to be the primary players in the scene reflects the basis for traditional models, especially in the mid-20th century, of American art history and historic house museum interpretation, in which a frequently white, affluent scholar or docent diligently recited lists of makers and privileged owners associated with various objects, emphasizing these details as the salient facts. This approach has since been de-emphasized by many institutions, including Winterthur, where the Perry Hall painting was recently featured in an exhibition on the history of slavery through objects in the museum's collection, for which I contributed video content. However, an exclusionary focus on elite historical figures continues to receive criticism at many house museums in the United States, discussed in such publications as Frank Vagnon's The Anarchist's Guide to Historic House Museums. These observations seem particularly relevant to a painting that has spent most of its history hanging in grand houses destined to become museums, from Perry Hall to Mount Clair to Winterthur. On a self-referential level, the historically interpreted space of the painting joins that of the early American House Museum in general as an elite-controlled environment in which a traditional white system has dictated the parameters of a viewer's attention, turning us away from lines of questioning and visual experience relating to apparently peripheral histories like that of the enslaved girl and the plantation's outbuildings. In other words, our past experiences of similar paintings and similar museum settings tends to condition us to expect the same kind of interpretation centered around stories of power and wealth. The frequently elite, white-centered narrative of the estate painting or house museum in the 20th century has its roots in the early development of the Americana collecting movement as an activity of WASP heritage building. Around the time of the centennial in 1876, many Americans, especially in the Northeast, began to embrace the collecting of early American objects as a way of constructing a national history and a sense of national pride, responding to something of an inferiority complex that the still relatively young nation had developed in comparison to the storied countries of Europe. Passing down of family antiques became an especially meaningful activity for members of elite, old American families who praised the supposedly pure beauty and simplicity of American furniture and paintings as evidence of their largely Anglo-American forebears' superiority, adding to a gathering sense of nostalgia for times past that was pervading aspects of popular culture. Multiple technological developments, such as the rise of increased industrial production, electricity, and motor vehicles, contributed to a general sense of American malaise. But a major driving factor was xenophobia amongst white Americans, exacerbated by waves of incoming immigrants from places like Italy and Eastern Europe that posed a perceived threat to dominant elite cultural groups. Needless to say, this was not a hospitable environment for the telling of subaltern histories like that of a Black girl at the center of a plantation painting. More recent scholarly research has refocused the interpretation of the painting of Perry Hall and others like it. John Michael Vlach and Anna O'Day Marley have recognized such landscapes as intentional expressions of the breadth of the planter's power, introducing enslaved people into the narrative indirectly as subjects of this domination. In Vlach's account, which encompasses not only the present view of Perry Hall, but also two others firmly attributed to Francis Guy, the serenity of the estate is designed to assert Gough's supreme control over his property, including not only land and animals, but also people. While noting the various trappings of power included in the pictures, from the sheer size of the mansion to the stylized beauty of the grounds, Vlach emphasizes slaveholding as the ultimate status symbol, incorporated into the paintings accordingly as a visual device. Summarizing the impact of the Perry Hall paintings in a similar fashion, Anna Marley distinguishes the series of works from the British landscape tradition in terms of their direct depiction of slave labor, in a seemingly unabashed celebration of Gough's slaveholding status with this picture here, also created by Francis Guy in the early 19th century. But as Vlach points out, the boldest depiction of Gough's laborers was of uncertain value to its owner. Unlike the images passed down in Gough's white family, Guy's painting of the enslaved at work in the plantation's fields was eventually given to a formerly enslaved worker at Perry Hall. More on this to come, perhaps suggesting a level of discomfort with the composition. Gough himself had a conflicted personal history with slavery, choosing to manumit 45 laborers in 1780, but dying almost 30 years later with an even larger number of enslaved people in his estate inventory. Even for early owners, then, the paintings of Perry Hall may have raised questions about the morality of the power that they were intended to project. One might argue that in representing slave-master relationships as peaceable, the painters of the Perry Hall paintings sought a reconciliation of such ethical tensions. As Maury McInnes has proposed with respect to the Julius Brutus Stearns painting, dated 1851, of Mount Vernon entitled Washington as a Farmer. Slavery here is rendered, quote, benevolent and natural, with Washington depicted as a benign patriarch alongside a group of healthy, well-dressed enslaved people. The Custis children on the left complete this pleasant, bucolic scene, playing amiably nearby. There are echoes of this dynamic in the painting of Perry Hall's field workers, among whom amble a white gentleman, you can see in the center here, perhaps Guff, perhaps his son-in-law, with two small boys and a trio of romping dogs, seeming to turn a scene of hard physical labor, enforced by the presence of the enslaver, into one of benevolently supervised industry. However, as Vlach argues, the representation of slave labor is unusual within an ostensible emblem of gentility, and as such, this particular scene might be considered an ill-advised composition on the artist's part, even a failure. The Winter Tour painting of Perry Hall provides arguably a more successful evocation of slavery as a status symbol from the 18th century perspective, incorporating casual references to the institution rather than making it a primary focus, thereby removing the inevitability of unpleasant associations for the Guff family, while seeming to offer some potential efforts at moral reconciliation. Shown walking alongside the Guffs and the Carrolls, who seem to be out for a gentle stroll, the enslaved nursemaid may be at work, but her situation at this moment is rendered as one of relative ease. Further, she seems to be represented as a member of the family group, holding the hand of one of the small boys. A closer look at the girl's figure and face, however, destroys this illusion, in my opinion. Here is an image under a slightly brighter light, which I think allows you to see a bit more of the detail of her features. She's depicted in a transparent dress that reveals the contours of her body. Further, her face, which appears almost featureless from across the room, has been rendered with an oversized, jutting lower lip, which you can just about make out here. These shocking touches of racialization and sexualization of a girl are not visible except up close, suggesting that the painter may have added them out of a kind of secret racist attempt at witticism, leaving them to lie in wait for the viewer who looks carefully. Any effect of moral reconciliation is removed by these details, through which the enslaved girl becomes objectified and dehumanized, the subject of an uncomfortably close gaze. If Maury McInnes's analytical framework for the painting of Washington as a farmer is applicable here, it can only function on the painting of Perry Hall as it appears from afar. Although the historiographic models I've cited here are useful as guides to understanding paintings of Perry Hall as emblems of elite power, none of these analyses takes the viewpoint of the Black figures depicted. Vlach and Marley focus on the impact of the pictures from the perspective of their white owners, which is, of course, important for us to understand. But what happens if we extend into full considerations of the enslaved experience in our analysis of these paintings? What if we set aside the uncertainty in answering questions about the possible identity of the Black girl in the Perry Hall picture and proceed to ask them anyway? Although, as we've seen, the girl has been dehumanized, it is nonetheless distinctly possible and even probable that the figure represents a real person. Since she is shown alongside images of the Guff and Carroll families, it's reasonable to propose that her picture too is a portrait, even if a distorted one. Due to the common erasure of subaltern history, it may be difficult to tell much of her story. However, as the historian of slavery in New England, Wendy Warren, has powerfully argued, this does not mean that we should not attempt to do so. Like the New England enslaved woman that Warren writes of in her article, The Cause of Her Grief, quote, "This woman's life deserves to be reconstructed simply because too many factors have conspired to make that reconstruction nearly impossible." Certainly, much energy has been expended on attempting to identify the artist and the white figures in the painting of Perry Hall. A rebalanced interpretation must consider enslaved people as individuals in their own right, and not only as, quote, "adjuncts to white gentility," as Catherine Mooney has termed the role of slave quarters in relation to mansion houses on many plantation sites that now operate as museums. In this spirit, my research has mined various sources in order to propose a speculative biography of the enslaved girl in the Perry Hall picture. Even if unconfirmed, this exploration transforms an anonymous, one-dimensional figure mentioned only in relationship to white protagonists or oppressors into a complex individual with a story worthy of being heard. We can begin simply by asking questions that haven't yet been asked. First of all, can we identify this young woman by name? A starting point is Harry Dorsey Gough's 1808 estate inventory, which includes a list of enslaved people. Shockingly, but sadly not at all atypically, grouped alongside tools and other objects as pieces of property. Unfortunately, this account does not include many details about individual working assignments or life circumstances, but we can get a sense for birth dates based on the numbers that appear beside each name. These are known not to be ages as we might expect, but to be the number of years that each person had left to serve by the terms of Gough's conditional manumissions, which took effect at the age of 25, but were put in place a number of years earlier. A combination of these likely birth dates and oral history of some of the descendants of Perry Hall workers leads us to a strong possible candidate for the role of the nursemaid in the painting. I believe she may have been a girl called Sib, whose name appears 4 lines down from the top of Gough's estate inventory. Sib is listed with 5 years left to serve, meaning that she was 20 years old when the inventory was made in 1808. This gives her a birth date of 1788. If the picture was made between 1795 and 1798, which is a range based on the known birth dates of the Gough grandchildren, then Sib would have been between 7 and 10 years old at the time of the painting. Quite young, but absolutely appropriate for a children's companion and plausible for the diminutive figure shown alongside the Gough family. Adding strength to this possible identification is further information about Sib Hall's family, thanks to the research of Hampton curator Greg Weidman. Listed alongside Sib in 1808 are the names of her daughters, Esther and Beck. We know from later records that these women had the last name of Hall. A Hall family tradition holds that Esther Hall, Sib's daughter, was a servant and companion of Sophia Gough Carroll, who's depicted with her 2 small sons in the Perry Hall painting, and again in this portrait by Charles Willson Peale. It reasonably follows that Sib, as the mother of Sophia Gough's companion, could have held a similarly intimate position to the one claimed for Esther within the Gough family, perhaps taking up the role of a nursemaid. Equipped with some of these details, we can begin to sketch a rough picture of the living conditions and daily experience of Sib Hall and her family. Because Sib herself appears infrequently in the Gough papers, I rely more on the more regular references to her daughter Esther and sometimes her daughter Beck to provide a sense for Sib's likely circumstances. In the Gough estate inventory of 1808, we can see that Sib is listed as, quote, tolerable healthy, and Esther as a fine girl, suggesting that the Halls were able-bodied, at least relative to some others on the plantation. Notably, health problems and even perceived behavior issues are recorded for other enslaved people appearing on the list, including annotations such as weakly, sickly, lame, and simply complaining. Although it's not clear how Perry Hall work assignments were determined, the Halls may have been selected to serve as companions in part for their good health, a reasonable criterion for someone in frequent close contact with the enslaver's family. The problematic power dynamics of supervising the master's children must have been highly charged and confusing, especially for a young girl. In spite of these close relationships, the family does not appear to have received special treatment in terms of everyday living conditions. Although nursemaids and other personal servants were sometimes required to sleep in the mansion house, the appearance of the Hall women's names in account books, among many others, suggests that the Hall family seems to have resided with other members of the enslaved community. It's possible that all three women, Sib, Esther, and Beck, slept in the complex of buildings depicted at the right of Perry Hall in this detail image shown at the top of this slide. Seen in greater detail in Guy's painting of field workers at bottom here, these structures appear to consist of a large central barn surrounded by a series of 5 smaller buildings that could reasonably be residences. If these represent the full extent of Perry Hall's slave quarters, living conditions would have been quite cramped for the population of approximately 60 people listed in Gough's 1808 inventory. Later in the 18th century, slaveholders would engage in efforts to improve enslaved living conditions, but the state of Perry Hall's quarters in the 1790s is uncertain. Gough's 1808 inventory includes only a few objects listed in, quote, the quarter and the overseer's house, and these are all work-related, suggesting that personal items such as beds, blankets, and clothing were not taken into account. Esther is recorded receiving distributions of blankets and beds on a semi-annual basis in the years from 1827 to 1841. Men and women on the plantation were also supplied with clothing once or twice a year. Men's clothes were commonly cut out for them, whereas women were given stocks of cotton, including blue plaid, to make their own garments. Whatever their other duties may have been, we can reasonably assume that Sib and Esther and eventually Beck spent at least some of their time sewing and possibly washing clothes. Esther's daughter Sydney would go on to identify herself as a washwoman in later years when she was living as a free woman in the city of Baltimore. Enslaved people at Perry Hall may have benefited to a certain degree from a general increase in perceived humanitarianism that characterized early Republican approaches to slaveholding in the Chesapeake. For instance, the Gough's religious beliefs directly led to the creation of communal spaces for worship. Visible on either side of the mansion house in depictions of Perry Hall are 2 steepled adjunct spaces, one of which contained a bathhouse, the other a chapel. The fact that the Goughs worshipped alongside their enslaved people raises questions about whether church attendance was compulsory. However, the story of Gough's conversion suggests that it was African Americans who inspired his religious beliefs rather than the other way around. The Perry Hall area was an early breeding ground for Methodism among African Americans, even before Gough took up the cause. If Sib and Esther and Beck were themselves believers, the opportunity to attend church regularly may have provided some comfort to daily life. In general, life for enslaved people at Perry Hall may have been somewhat less harsh than at other plantations in the area due to the Gough's avowed, although hypocritical, religious beliefs. The manumissions granted in the 1780s at Perry Hall were religiously motivated, with Gough professing himself, quote, convinced of the injustice of detaining my fellow creatures in slavery and bondage. However, his relationship to the church would prove erratic, and he was reportedly expelled from the Methodist community for a time. It's not clear how Gough's inconsistent beliefs may or may not have impacted his attitudes towards punishment on the plantation. In spite of the fact that she was a committed Methodist, Prudence Gough continued to hold slaves even after her more ambivalent husband's death. At Perry Hall, the 1820 Baltimore County Census shows a population of 38 slaves living within the household, along with just 2 free Black people. Some of this number may have been serving a limited term of slavery, as was the case for Sib and Esther and Beck for periods of their lives. Although the names Esther and Beck continue to appear in the Perry Hall account books through 1841, during later years, the sisters were paid wages, and documents show that they were manumitted in 1808. According to manumission records, each of Esther's children were also granted conditional freedom, with their terms of indenture set to expire on their 25th birthdays. Tracing Sib and Esther's lives leads us into a longer family history. The document seen here records that Esther's daughter, Sidney Hall Davidge, was raised in Baltimore, and that according to the terms of Esther's manumission, Sidney was free from the age of 25. Sidney's 5 children, including one named Hester, perhaps an interchangeable spelling for Esther, after her grandmother, were free from the time of their births. Nonetheless, the family retained vestiges of their connection to Perry Hall. Sidney married a man called Charles Davidge, whose name appears frequently among lists of the Perry Hall enslaved, suggesting that their relationship was founded on ties formed at the plantation before they departed. Further, in an enduring link to the plantation's material life, it was Esther and subsequently Sidney and her descendants who became the owners of Francis Guy's painting of the field workers at Perry Hall, reportedly given to Hall by Harry Dorsey Gough or by his son in 1808. This image of enslaved laborers makes a seemingly strange present. We cannot know, of course, whether it was a welcome gift, but the painting's preservation and descent through the Hall family suggests that it was valued in some way. Although we do not know how the Halls displayed or used the painting, it's possible that the family found a way to impart new meaning to the image, akin to acts of repurposing and iconoclasm made by African Americans in the Civil War South, as written about in the work of Jennifer Van Horn. For the Halls, the image may have been considered in some ways a totem of freedom, representing not simply a memory of oppression, but a continuous visual announcement of the family's release from their prior circumstances of bondage. As Jennifer Van Horn has proposed with respect to other instances of emancipated African Americans' ownership of slaveholders' art, perhaps the act of taking possession of this work triggered a transformation in meaning, inverting the balance of elite white power originally encapsulated by the picture. If Winterthour's painting includes a portrait of Sib Hall, we can only wonder how her daughter and granddaughter may have felt about this equally complicated representation and its continued ownership by her enslaver's family rather than her own. Much of this attempt at biography is speculative and due to the inherent limitations of reconstructing subaltern history, it may or may not improve in clarity with further research. Nonetheless, it provides a basis for a new interpretation of the Perry Hall painting, one that not only incorporates but actually forefronts the presence of the Black girl. It also opens up access to a Black genealogical narrative, ever present in our interpretation of white portraiture, but so often absent from early American art histories when it comes to African American families. Sidney Hall's granddaughter, Ida, perhaps the great-great-granddaughter of the girl in the Perry Hall picture, would go on to become the first Black kindergarten teacher in Baltimore. Sidney's grandson, Harry, would become the first Black man to graduate from the University of Maryland Law School in 1889. He was a very prominent figure in Baltimore and was also the first Black man elected to public office in Maryland as a city council member. Looking at the Perry Hall painting from this expanded perspective, widening the scope of the timeline as well as the narrative under consideration, I believe we deepen our understanding not only of a single early American painting, but also of how historical images continue to function in our contemporary environment, taking on new meanings according to our center of focus. We cannot negate the racism underlying the picture of Perry Hall and others like it, in which the violence of slavery is literally painted over by an idealizing vision of pastoral beauty and harmonious relationships. But I do think we can ask something new from these pictures in our own time and place by recentering our attention on the Black histories behind works like this. In closing, I'd like to thank the number of scholars and museum professionals who have encouraged me in pursuing this research and have shared research with me, including Jason Bush, Michelle Fitzgerald, Elizabeth Mallon, Catherine Dan Rober, Jennifer Van Horn, and Greg Weidman. Thank you.